Well, let's get started here. This is the next session on evaluating alpaca fiber. This is probably the central reason why everybody raises alpacas, at least the reason why they're supposed to be raising them. But so we're going to cover this. I have started here with, there we go, starting here with a vicuña, which is not an alpaca, but I thought it was a good place to start because when we started in the 1990s, it had just been discovered that alpacas had originated and were domesticated from the vicuña, 1,000 or more years ago. I think it was up to 2,000 years ago or more. And up until that time, up until the 1990s and even into the 2000s, many people were still claiming that alpacas came from the guanaco, the same as the llama. Does it make a great deal of difference? Not really, other than that there is a pretty big difference between the guanaco fiber and the vicuña fiber. And most people refer to vicuña fiber as being the most valuable, and we're going to address that at the end part of this program to really see if that's really the case. We had seen that since alpacas had originated from them, and they had discovered mummies and garments and fabric from prior to pre-conquest, before the Spanish conquest in South America, that the alpaca items were of similar quality to the vicuña. We saw it as a very likely progression that alpacas will improve back to that level of quality. And we saw that as being something that really interested us as far as breeders go, but also to make them a very viable livestock. So it's kind of interesting. Alpacas pretty much are unknown around the world for the most part. There's been a lot of education in the last 20 years. So hopefully with education as well as being a breeder, people look to you just because you own animals, that automatically you are now an expert. So you need to know everything that you have to, because whatever you say is going to come through as being absolutely factual. So after the Spanish conquest is when alpacas really went downhill. They had pretty much destroyed the alpaca industry as they set up the Spanish systems in South America, and they lost millions and millions of alpacas, basically the same as we did with the buffalo here in the Indians. So a very, very similar progression. Importation started in the 1990s. I guess there were some that came in the 80s, along with some llamas. And there was a lot of, call it, regulations as far as exporting animals out of South America because of foot and mouth disease. And it wasn't until the early 1990s that pretty much everybody, including Peru, became designated as foot and mouth disease free. And I don't want to say it opened up the floodgates of alpacas, but that was the time that the importations really started bringing in top breeding quality animals, at least those that were available, that they were willing to sell as culls in South America. And what they came in were, as you see on the screen here, primitive, unimproved, and improved. There was less than 2,000 animals that came in. I think it was less than 1,800 that came in from Peru that would be considered the improved type. And that was really only about 50 or 60 years that they really spent breeding them properly to get them to that level. Whereas most of the alpacas that were coming in and still coming in the 90s, those that came in before the 90s and through the 90s from Chile and other Indian farmers, were of unimproved or primitive style. So looking around the internet, you will see animals that will even look and have some of those primitive style characteristics as you're looking at animals that people have and that are even breeding today. And what we're going to address is, when is there a diminishing return because of the time involved and the amount of advancement that's necessary? And feel free to ask questions. You just unmute, or there's a chat bar that you can ask your questions on. Here is just a little slide as to the microscopic comparisons of different fibers. The wools are on, coarse wool and fine wool are on the far left, and alpaca, and then followed by cashmere. What's obvious between all these is the scale height. And that obviously would make a difference in a few different things as far as handle goes, as well as how the fibers act and hold together. The scales on the wool is part of what, and even on alpaca, is part of what holds the fibers together in a yarn. So when you wash it, it actually acts as a ratchet and will shorten up as there's agitation and a felting process that goes on. Now, in smart wool, that is used for things that don't shrink by running through the washer and dryer, they actually have a chemical process that wipes those scales down on the wool and fills in the holes with plastic. So it's kind of a hybrid, natural fiber and plastic product, and a synthetic overlay that's on it. But it works, and it has some of the properties with it, and that's been very popular. Cashmere there is the same thing, although I haven't heard anything about cashmere. But you can see the distance between the scales, and that's also what gives it its sheen and its shine. Now, I'm assuming the alpaca that's shown there is wakaya, just because the distance between the scales are very short, whereas in Suri, there's a much larger distance, and that's where the shine comes from. We're going to go a little bit through here. So fiber testing terminology, I don't think we have to cover much on here. I think the most important here is just how the fibers, some of the testing that we do refers to the individual fibers, and some of the testing results refers to the relationship of the other fibers within the sample, such as, let's see, where are we at here? Comfort factor. That's one that's either referred to as a comfort factor or fibers over 30, and they're actually the inverse of each other when you see those. We're going to talk a little bit about modulation, resistance to compression. Actually, what's not mentioned on here is curvature, and there is a direct relationship, very predictable relationship between curvature and resistance to compression, and to why that's an important factor, or can be an important factor for different types of products and when it comes into play. So methods of testing. I'm going to assume everybody here has an idea of the different that people do test fiber. We don't have to go into much on that. Other than that, the main methods are the OFTA 100. It's somewhat controversial between the alpaca community and how this is being used. It uses a 2 millimeter snippet. That fiber sample is then tested. It's cleaned. It's tested at the same humidity as all the other samples that come through. Of all the tests, it's able to test the largest fiber sample. In other words, the most snippets of the most fiber of any other test. It is designed to meet the International Wool Trade Association standards, and it does qualify as the best farm-to-farm comparison, or fibers from one farm to fibers to another farm, when comparing fibers that are produced. The next most popular, very popular test is the OFTA 2000, where it tests the full staple. There's issues with that we'll take a look at here in a little bit, about how environmental factors such as stress can actually improve the average fiber diameter. The OFTA 2000 generally uses a smaller sample. It's not able to test as many fibers. 20 years ago, the machine they had was actually less than 100. I think now they're up to a couple thousand. But that will have an effect as to how a small amount of fibers that aren't a true representation of the whole fleece can change the standard deviation or coefficient of variation. OFTA 2000 does not use a cleaned fiber sample, and whatever humidity is available at the time is what it's tested at. The machine is not sold as being designed for farm-to-farm comparisons. There's also the FiberLux that we're familiar with, that we use here in our farm, that is used strictly for grading. And if you're quick and fast and easy, and the only other alternative, if you're not sure how to grade yourself or not comfortable with your opinion as to what that grade is that you can use a sorter, which charges about the same as what a fiber test would cost. But sorters, of course, test more than one area of a fleece, of a blanket or a clip, and you have the ability to do that with the FiberLux. It's a great machine, and I'll throw in a plug for that, for groups of people or associations that want to provide benefits to their members to help them with their processing and breeding decisions without having to wait or go through some of the other testing. All right, so here's a histogram of a standard histogram. Actually, it's actually a little bit more than standard. It has, the standard one only has the first four: mean fiber diameter, standard deviation coefficient, and fibers greater than 30. That's the standard simple OFTA 100 test. This one has a few other things that are brought in as far as spin fineness, mean curvature, and standard deviation of curvature. I think of note on this animal here, we'll come back to this at some point, is the actual very low standard deviation and coefficient of variation, and the mean fiber diameter. Now, this was back on I think this was a 3-year-old animal at the time. I'm going to do the age 07 sample date. No, it was 1 year. And he was sold with his mother to a customer. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happened. This was a medium or dark brown little male. And I thought he was just phenomenal. But this is where understanding the relationship of fineness and density and volume would have really have helped in their decision-making process. But we'll come back to that at some point. Here's an EPD histogram. I'm assuming everybody has heard of EPDs. The sessions following this, we're going to talk a little bit more about breeding and using EPDs, but we use more data. So here's we've got about 12 or 13 different characteristics that we're testing for, starting with, in the top paragraph, the total poundage, total fleece weight, and then mean fiber diameter and so forth as it goes through. This is are we coming back to this here? Sample date. So this is on a 5-year-old male, fawn male, I think. Yeah. So the different things that you should look at in testing, and we're going to get into that in the end part of this program. So often when you're making decisions, whether it's for breeding, buying, whatever it may be, you're rarely ever comparing animals that have the same fiber diameter, the same age, same color. There's always going to be a different environment, being the big thing that is hard to factor in when you're looking at different animals. And we're going to cover that a little bit and actually show how EPDs can help with that in another program. But even with using histograms and a little chart that I have, it will help classify animals in a little bit more accurate light. Let's see. And here is an OFTA 2000 report. This is page 1. Now, this is an OFTA 2000 before Ian Watt took it. So I don't know if his are the same. Maybe they were combined into one page, but previously was done by 2 pages. So this was the first page of OFTA 2000, and then here's the one that people normally see and think of with the OFTA 2000 report. People like it because it shows environmental factor, and you can see it right here. Now, this was on a young girl that we had. I think she was 3 years old at the time. Do I have it here? Did I write it down? But I think she was 3 years old, and this should have been tested right when she was at 2. Or what was it? But just before she got pregnant. Mm-hmm. And it really dropped within the first few months. Well, if there was no environmental issue, whether it would be stress, and I think it was stress because this would have been during the show period for her. If there had not been that stress, you would assume that would be more of a straight line going at 21 all the way across. So actually the stress had helped her AFD and made it look better, but there would definitely be a break in that fiber.
I think you need to explain that chart is the entire staple length of that animal. So a fiber which is grown just at shearing would be on the left-hand side. And as it grew out the weeks and months until the last shearing is the variation that you see in the chart. You can see that the dip And we assumed that the dip was midway between when shearing was and the last shearing. And that coincides with fall show season, that coincides with winter, cold months. And so those environmental factors do play a part in changing your fiber diameter. Just like when people go through illness or pregnancy or some other stress in their life, it changes your hair. And it changes the hair on alpacas.
They don't go gray, though.
They don't go gray.
Yeah.
Well,
there wouldn't be any reason to have a gray breeding program if they did. Anyway, so next, this is taken out of the book of The Art and Science of Alpaca Judging, written by a number of judges. So this kind of shows the scoring and what they look at as far as being from ideal down to, from a score of 9.5 to 10 down to 0 to 3. Everybody's fiber falls within that category, and one of those. But the only ones that anybody shows are in ideal or excellent. maybe some very good show up, but you rarely see any fibers that are in the good to, below average. That's kind of like, the rest of everything else on social media is that you just assume if you don't have that you're nowhere. You don't have any animals that have any value. And we're going to talk a little bit about what this character is and why we look at that and what are the important factors so that you can really put things into the proper perspective as you plan your breeding program. What we're actually talking about here, when you look at the ideal and the excellent type, is we're looking at architecture. If you've heard that term that judges use, which is, the bundling and just the whole makeup of the fleece, which is the crimp, the uniformity, the density of the bundles, and so forth. The difference between ideal and excellent is really the amount of bundling that goes on. There could be a little bit denser bundling in the ideal, but it's a little hard to tell from a picture. Very good shows bundles too. I mean, in the third one down, it has, you can see that there's definitely separations, and we're going to look to see what that looks like in the skin and why that's important. Often, when people see this, they refer to the animal having the genetics for that. And in a very loose way of using genetics, that's kind of true, but it's not. It's an environmental factor as well that can play a part. So we'll go into more as to what we're referring to with that. I don't know. No one here has Surreys. Okay. So we don't have to go on much here, but you can see the same thing in this. The same thing in the Surrey world is that they have the bundling and they're separate. Those locks are separate all the way down to the skin. So that's an indication of the bundling, and we'll show you what that looks like in the skin. But a big part about Surreys, though, is luster. And we didn't really talk about brightness in alpaca. Maybe we will as we get into a point. So here, this is what it looks like in the skin. You've got your primary fibers and secondary. One of my favorite questions as a 4-H judge would be to ask my contestants in the ring on their knowledge of alpacas as to which is the most desirable fiber that they breed for in their alpacas. Is it the primary fiber or the secondary fiber? And very frequently they'll always say primary because they think primary is the best at first. And they've even been taken to by parents to say, I must not know what I'm talking about. But the primary fiber is something that is considered to be part of a two-coat system that the alpaca has. The ideal alpaca, though, will have a very small amount of primary fibers, and they'll have a higher ratio of secondary fibers. So when we're looking at this in the skin, and we're looking at this bundling, you can see that you start off with the primary fiber follicle, and that has sebaceous glands as well as sweat glands, whereas the secondary fibers just have sebaceous glands. So an animal would not survive without primary. You have to have sweat glands in order to survive. And so there is no method, and there's nothing that is recommended to try to breed primary fibers away, because you would not have a healthy animal. The process is to improve the fineness of a primary fiber and increase the ratio of secondary fibers to primaries. And that's what we're looking at in the skin. Now, down here below, this is just showing what happens in the development of the fibers in the skin during gestation. And between 160 and 265 days is when there's a lot that happens in your secondaries. If you get into fiber nutrition, if you're into shows, and into a lot of different areas, we may have time to talk about skin biopsies and how something with nutrition could even make a difference, possibly with skin biopsies as well. But you can kind of see what's being developed there. It's showing the secondary derived on 265 days. There's actually a group of secondaries, and I think they call it a tertiary type development, that these will grow up into large groups, not just 3, there could be 6, 10, 12 or more that'll grow up. And that's where you really see the high bundling and the high density bundles. This is a fleece judging. Of course, we only show our best ones. So here's our top one. In fact, now this isn't the one Cameron Holt did, but Cameron Holt was always the top Australian judge who would come to the U.S., and he was the most critical of the American alpaca. And I think his score was like 92 on his card. And that was the most he had ever scored in animals. So this is the one little guy that we had. These are the, what do you call them, the freaks that are just different. Full brothers or full sisters, and they don't have that quality. So things do pop out at different times. But the judge goes through and scores. So we looked at the different characteristics, and they just throw a score on there based upon what the fineness and handles, uniformities, the styles, what are the characters, the crimp, the stipple, and all the different things that go through. It talks about brightness. Well, that brightness is the same as what Surrey luster is, in that there's just a higher sheen to the fiber. Well, we'll get into values of fiber and what characteristics actually have an economic value enhancement, or whether it's just a show quality. Lack of modulation is just a visual response. And the interesting one here was years back, probably I think it was early 2000s, that AOA decided in this flea show system that they were going to put in an annualized weight into the shows. And meaning that based upon an animal's age category, what age that they were being shown at, their fleece would be weighed in as it got to the show, and it would be assigned points based upon its annualized weight. There was nothing differentiating the value of those points or how many points it got based upon the fineness of the animal. It didn't make any difference. So you got the same amount of points if you had a 15 micron fiber as you did a 25 micron fiber. And we'll see how that puts finer animals at a disadvantage. In fact, we had one male that, as a 5 or 6 year old breeding male at 26 micron, won a color championship over 40 some animals in the show. And he definitely was the finest. He was very uniform. It was very nice fleece. But I was very surprised that they would give it that type of thing. But it was all because of the fleece weight. He was dense. He had a lot of fiber. I think it was over 12 pounds. So it was, very impressive in that regard. Let's see here. So this is a little thing showing again in the skin. But what I wanted to show you on this picture is the follicle group. So this is what develops with a primary and secondary. And as Cameron Holt would refer to, they're built in like little bricks in the wall. But when you're looking at a skin biopsy, this is basically what you would see. And down below here is what it looks like when it's sheared off. I have this one here just kind of basically to show you a little bit on scale height. This is a drawing. It's not an actual membership. But what I'm looking at here in the paracortex and orthocortex, the only reason why this is important is in Wakayas is that the amount of orthocortex is in how it's positioned is going to determine your crimp. And that's what it makes up. Surreys have an ortho and paracortex, but instead of them being divided as this is on half and half or in percentages, is that they actually have little shafts that run down individually. So there's little dark dots in between the white ones, and that doesn't allow it to crimp up like a Wakaya does. The orthocortex is always on the outside of the fiber when there's crimp involved. And the frequency that it twists determines your frequency of crimp. And here's a picture down below of ortho and paracortexes and surrey. For those that need. Little scale height comparison. Sheep wool is just under a micron, about 0.8 of a micron of scale height, whereas Wakaya is down to 0.2 to 0.35, very similar to Vicuña. Surprise. And Surrey is actually the smallest scale relief of basically nothing to 0.08. And this is done with electron microscopy. In fact, the first electron microscopy was done in 2004 or 2005. And that's when they really started learning a lot about Surreys. Now, we've mentioned a little bit about medulation. It's something that especially new breeders really are concerned with when they look at a histogram. But if you take a look at what this is saying here, from having the most medulation, you're talking about 60 micron or more in diameter. And it drops down as it gets finer to E, which is under 20 micron, and there's non-medulated. Medulation and medulla is directly related to fiber diameter. Many people talk about using it in their breeding decisions, and I'm not quite sure how that. I guess it depends on what you're breeding for. But even if you look at 20 to 30 micron, it's really not an issue. Your guard hairs are going to have the most medulation, and we'll take a look at what that looks like in a histogram here in a little bit, a medulated histogram. Medulation is not hollow; it's just a different type of consistency, and it brings in. It takes up dye at a different rate, so it can change color. So for the most part, in the cottage market and hand spinners and dyers, it's really not an issue. Commercial processors would definitely have more of a problem with it, but it's not anything that we've run across that has been an issue for people buying fiber. So this is what many of the histograms out there that you're looking at will look like. Joachim McCall did a lot of the testing. It's now done by SGS, and there's a difference when it comes to a histogram that shows medulated fibers. Its medulation testing can only be done with very light or white fibers, and it actually shows a double histogram, whereas in this first one here, the light gray is actually the regular histogram. It's showing that the main fibers are about 15 micron, and it has an average fiber diameter of 16 and standard deviation of 4. Fibers greater than 30 micron is 1%. So where's all this medulation coming from that he's showing here? So people look at this and think there's a lot of medulation. Well, no. Angus McCall had his way of showing this in a chart. And what that is referring to is that each of those long dark gray lines are referring to the percentage of the fibers that it's connected to down below. And this one will say that, like for an example, let me see here, right here, that's about 11.5% of these fibers here are medulated. Hopefully you see that. Does that make sense?
And then explain the tail.
And this all the way down here is the tail. So these are your guard hair. Now that all gets de-haired out and skirted, so it's a non-issue. And I'm going to show you the SGS histogram, and that's going to make a lot more sense. Same thing here. So these are always very confusing, and you're going to run across a lot of people that even today don't understand them. In fact, I asked a senior judge who was an importer as to between these two, which is preferred, and he actually said the one that has the medulation right inside the sample, right on top of the regular histogram is the preferred way, which is not. You want it as far away as possible. You want your medullated fibers to be in your guard hairs way off to the right, and so they can be skirted out. Otherwise, if they're right within the sample, there's no way to skirt them. They're all part of the processing that you're going to have. All right, here's the SGS medulation histogram, in which the blue is the fiber histogram, and the black area is showing the medulation. So you can see that the fibers here, if we take this one here at right here, about 25% of this fiber here, that's 26 micron, about 25% is medulated. But as you get down to the 30 micron, it's basically about 100% of that is medulated. So it's a little bit easier to understand of what that's actually referring to. And of course, you would want to try to run these off. Also, one thing to keep in mind, if you ever do, depending upon what you're dealing with and who you're dealing with, sometimes you'll see a histogram that doesn't show anything over 30 micron. Everything stops. There's no tail going off down this direction. Does that mean that you have a phenomenal animal that has nothing that's over 30 micron? The testers do have the ability to stop at 30 micron and only test that. The thinking being, and is used a lot in sheep, is that over 30 micron is being de-haired off. So they just want to know what the average fiber diameter is without 30. So if you ever see anything that doesn't have any tail at all, you really should be skeptical as to, and if it stops at 30, you should be skeptical. No, if it's a 10 micron animal and everything stops at 25, that's probably pretty accurate. So, but I don't think we're there yet. Well, that's kind of covered everything that we have as far as the fleece characteristics, other than developing a breeding plan. We just basically set some goals, and in order to be successful, is that your goals of what you set up as far as what you're looking to do, and we'll talk more in this, hopefully with some questions, is that number one, it needs to be a heritable trait, and understanding the difference between what's heritable and what's environment is going to be important. That if you're going to do a goal, is that you need to develop some type of measurable result of where you're looking to get and be able to see how well you're doing on things. And then third, that is that there's an economic value to your process of what you're looking to develop. All right, goals and objectives. This is very much what we look at, and there's a little different, or I guess what most people seem to be looking for when they're looking at goals and objectives. These are probably the primary ones that people look at: is fineness, fleece weight production, conformation, and color. In our program, initially we had to pay a lot more attention on conformation than what we do now, since we're pretty much a closed herd. So we kind of know where we are and what we're going to get on conformation. And we look at fineness, but it's always paired with fleece weight. We're never considering fineness without what it's doing in a fleece weight production. Here's sustainability. When you're looking at developing your goals and your plan, this kind of gives you an idea of what we consider when we're looking at fiber. The large bale, we had done collections for the Alpaca blanket project for years, and while that was operational, and we'd bale these things up, and this is basically what a bale would look like that we would send off. Although the people supplying for the blanket project weren't getting $6 a pound. Back in 2013, that was the average commercial raw price for alpaca fiber. But there was also buyers that would buy royal grade. This little box there has 18 pounds of royal grade that was sold at $48 a pound that fit in that little box. a lot less shipping costs sending that off. There is that big bale, a lot less feed and everything else that goes into it. And that certain fibers, if it met even more strict requirements, was getting up to $55 a pound. Now, in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous difference. Now, that was really the only commercial buyer we ran across that was paying that price. But now we're running across, we would go to shows and events selling our fiber, and we would have our royal grade. We try to get more money for our yarns, or we have our fleeces, and people's eyes would just glaze over. They had no idea what we were talking about. Today, when we go to these shows, we sell out. Not so much of our yarns, but we sell out of our raw fibers that we're selling at that. And we sell it at $50 a pound if it's fitting into that royal grade. So that's something that's changed. And in setting your goals, that's also another area to look at, is where is this industry heading? Where is it going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, through the period that you're going to be raising alpacas? And if you're breeding, obviously, that's the purpose of understanding fiber and fleece characteristics, is how to improve your herd and how to set your farm in the point of making a profit. So we talked a little bit about how valuable alpaca fiber is, or vicuña fiber. It was always considered the most valuable. Vicuña fiber in 2022 sold for $400 a pound. And that's quite a bit of money. And generally, I think it's, let me see, is it Laurel Piana that generally buys a lot of the vicuña out of South America. But this here, and their statement is, there's good wine and there's bad wine, and they just buy the good wine. And that's what they make their $10,000 suits or sweaters from, and $50,000 suits. Well, here is a Chinese company back in 2004 that paid $675. Some say it was $670,000, depending on which article you're looking at, for 90 kilograms of merino that was sold by Prime Merino in Australia. That's $3,400 a pound. And a Chinese company bought that, and they were going to be making $100,000 suits out of it. It was the first bale that, at least that it referred to in the article, that broke the 12 micron level. And I also understand it was a very, very uniform micron. So it was like a 2% type of standard deviation. So there were some reasons for it. It was a record bale. I haven't heard of anything else selling for that kind of price, but I know things are selling for hundreds of dollars a pound. Lorno Piana has a sale or a contest or an auction each year where they purchase a bale, and they purchase bales, and they're tested. And I know that there's bales that are hitting 10 micron of merino and so forth. So there's value to very fine fibers. This is the chart that I was referring to. That's kind of helpful. So there's different areas on this here. In the top area, this is also on my website. If you've had a chance, there's a link to it. You can print this off. This top area here is just a relationship of microns. So here on the left-hand column is fiber diameter. Top row is also fiber diameter. I can compare an 18 micron fiber with a 24. And a 24 micron fiber is going to be 178% coarser and heavier than a 18. This area here on the side, the circle, and the printout that you get will show the whole thing, is a 24 micron circle compared to what a 12 micron circle is. So if you're ever in a pizza place and they say they run out of 24-inch pizzas, and they're going to give you two 12-inch, are you going to take them up on that deal? There's more than 4 12-inch pizzas in a 24-inch pizza. And this kind of shows you the relationship in a two-dimensional picture. What I find to be the most helpful, and it wasn't until a judge that had talked about this fleece weight that was added to the show system and how that was a detriment, and finer fibers were going to be at a disadvantage, that I really started looking at this. And that's where I came up with this sheet. But the squares here at the bottom, the ABC, is what I find to be something that's very helpful to people if you can understand. Sometimes it takes a little bit of studying this a little bit to really understand what's going on. But box A here is 196 fibers of 24 micron fiber. B is 196 fibers of 18. Those are the same density. Density is the amount of follicles within a certain area. That's exactly the same. What's different is the volume. So when you're comparing animals, I mentioned that one little guy, that original histogram that was at 18 micron.
We're going to use this young male, this histogram, as an example as to what happens if you're not using the right tools to make your decisions. What ended up happening with this young male, as we found out, is that they gelded him and sold him as a fiber male because they felt he didn't have enough density. But let's really see what was going on. I mean, the histogram itself is a beautiful histogram. It's 18 micron. It's got a very low standard deviation for that micron, a great coefficient of variation. It's tall, thin, doesn't have a big, long, heavy tail of coarse fibers. This is what 15 years ago was like an ideal type breeding result that we had saw. Of course, it's a young male, and how he would develop yet to be seen. But the density was the concern that they had, and sold them as a fiber male. Now, if we take a look at the chart that we use to compare different microns, you can see that in 18 micron compared to what was common for dark brown animals 15 years ago or more was, or older animals, was definitely in the mid to upper 20 micron. So 18 to 26 micron, there's going to be a difference of over 100% difference in volume. Even 24 micron is 75, 80% more volume at 24 micron. So by feeling and just using that as a judgment as to determine density doesn't work. As you take a look at the bottom charts, that there is an A 196 fibers of 24 micron, that's 88,000 square micron, compared to B of 18 micron fleece of 196. So example C shows us that we would need 348 fibers of 18 micron in order to be equivalent in volume of the same number of fibers at 24 micron, in order to, it's 88,000 square micron. Actually, when you get up to 26 micron, it's even greater. It's actually 100% or over 100% more fibers. Over 400 fibers would be necessary. So the chart shows us that if your breeding program is to improve fineness and density, that's going to be pretty hard to do without using objective measurements. And as we get into the EPD program and using EPDs for making breeding decisions, it actually gets pretty simple. Another way to look at this would be,
if I were to magically convert a 24 micron animal that had 10 pounds of fiber, and I were to drop him down to 18 micron, we'd be looking at a difference of 56. We'd almost be dropping the weight in half. We'd almost be down to, if it was from 10 pounds, you'd be dropping down to 5 pounds. So if you have 7 pounds of 18 micron, you actually have a denser animal than a 10 pound at 24 micron. So it kind of gives you a comparison. If you're looking at animals and you're trying to compare animals of different age, you've got a nice guy that is now 26 micron, and you're comparing him to a guy that's younger and he's got finer. You need to look at what is the difference in micron. Where were they at that younger age compared to where this is at? Or actually, what's simpler is just simply use EPDs, and that's going to tell you everything. And as we get into genetics and breeding, I can show you how EPDs will show you what's happening here in A, B, and C very easily and quickly without having to do any math.
so in finishing up, we really should take a look at what is the ultimate guide on evaluating a fiber, and that's going to be what its value is in the marketplace. Whether you're talking about fibers that are selling at dollars per pound or thousands of dollars a pound, generally the controlling characteristic of that value is going to be average fiber diameter. And below 18 micron tends to carry the highest value. Along with that, though, you do need to have the uniformity, whether it's in the AFD, the micron count uniformity, or the color and staple length as well. There has been no value that I've been able to see that a buyer is willing to pay based upon trim. crimp style, or even curvature for that matter, as well as colors. Any variegated colors or spots in a fleece are generally not part of a buyer's profile of what they're looking to buy. What also would help for producing value for North American alpaca would be a centralized collection and grading program or system that we could set up. In addition to that, possibly scouring would also allow us to work directly with some of the mills that are looking to make purchases and bypass a buyer and possibly get more value for our fleeces in the meantime.
So these are the references that we use to go through in our slides that we've been using. The only one that's still available today is the one that's put on, or it's available through AOA. It's the Art and Science of Judging. When we bought ours, I think it was $120, and now they're down to we got a special, and now they're like $45. It's a must if you're raising alpacas. It's the only book to date that actually has been printed and made for alpaca breeders to help you understand what's going on. Is it perfect? It's not perfect, but it's got a lot of great information, and it really helps you understand all the different things that are behind the industry, why we're doing what we're doing, and at least the reasons as to what they're trying to get to.
The pictures and the diagrams are worth it because it really will help you evaluate your herd and to see where you want to be with your goals.
All right. Well, that's pretty much it. So we are open to questions.
You can hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Without the
Okay.
headphones.
The question, I had a question on fleece weight. When you're comparing density with fleece weight and using fleece weight as a guide to density. And I wonder just how much body size has been incorporated into the thinking of using fleece weight as an indicator of density. If you look at that, the 90 kilograms of wool that was sold for $675,000. I mean, there's been $3 or $4 million bales of wool sold in Australia over the last 20 years. But these are less than a pound of fleece taken off of an animal that's been shedded its entire life and weighs no more than 100 pounds. If you look at it, the bigger picture of fineness, it's really hard to put fleece weight with it unless you know the size of the animal. In other words, the size of the body area that's being shorn, because a bigger animal at 15 micron will cut more wool than a smaller animal at 15 micron. How you incorporate that size difference when you're using fleece weight as an indicator of density when compared animals of equal micron?
Well, there would be a classification here on the farm, but in classifying animals across the country, just based upon data and information available, there's no way to go by size. But you're right. I mean, it's something that has been assumed if it's a truly scientific finding, but it's believed that as animals get finer, they get smaller. But I don't have a way to compare my animals at a certain fineness and fleece weight with others based upon size anywhere else in the country. I can do it here on the farm, but not anywhere else. We definitely do look at our animals when we're shearing them, and we're surprised when we see, 120-pound animal that's, just turning 2 or a year and a half or thereabouts. We're shearing them and they've got, 8 pounds of fiber. That's 16 or 18 micron. That really wakes us up and say, well, there's something here to look at. And then they grow up, and of course they get coarser, and as follicles stop producing for whatever reason. Sometimes we don't know what's going on with that, but there's all different things that come into play. But size is important. But we've gone by the basis of saying, because heritability comes in, and there's all kinds of issues. But if I look at an animal and I say that he has an appropriate fineness range that we're looking for as far as choosing for a male to breed to, and he has the proper fleece weight, I'm comparing him with animals that I think start off based on those two items. They have to have the fineness in order for them to even qualify, but then they don't qualify if they don't produce the fleece weight. And fleece weight is not highly heritable.
But length for fleece weight is as important for me as density. If you don't believe in the density argument, and I don't, I'm ambivalent about what people think about that. But if you select for length and density together, you'll automatically get fineness, because every animal that is highly dense is fine. But the better ones for making a profit are the ones with the longer fleeces. That introduces, for me, the concept of crimp. If you have a high frequency crimp, those fleeces do not grow long. What you've got to get is greater depth between the crimps. And that's another style, that's another argument altogether with selecting animals. But one of the problems with length is you don't get significant length in animals with high frequency crimp. And that's a carryover from the old days, I suspect, from the Bradford system of classing wool.
There have been lawsuits threatened about the value of crimp.
Yeah, I know. And the beauty of the argument, John, as you know, is the crimp disappears in processing. So while we look at it and we put value on it, I think we put the wrong values on it. But crimp in itself just disappears in the processing system, and that's fine. Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to point out was SGS and the OFTA system that measures medulation. SGS and Joachim McCall use a 3-day growth sample. And if the medulation is not consistent through the fleece, then and it shows on the histogram, it's a pot shot. It may be what it is and isn't, because when they developed the OFTA system for measuring medulation, it was done for sheep in the first instance and then carried over to alpaca. They actually measure the medulation in snippets from the whole length, not from a 2-day period. And so I don't put much value at all on the medulation from Joachim McCall or SGS, because it's only measuring 3 days growth in the year. And if the medulation isn't consistent through the whole length of the fiber, it's a pot shot as to whether you just hit a pocket or you didn't.
But, even according, I think that was, we take a look at here at Art and Science of Judging, they're talking about basically when you start getting down below 20 micron, it's a non-issue though. Even down to in the 20s and 30s, I don't think it's an issue for even processors at that range.
Oh, I don't think it is either. It is either.
And curvature is the other, resistance to compression. Years ago, we were just in awe of, merino being a curvature of 120. But from what I understand, there's problems with that processing that type of curvature. And although you do want to have some amount of it, because it's going to reduce the amount of fibers necessary to make a thread or a yarn. But when you get into worsted garments, I don't know if it really has a high curvature, even has a lot of value. So the whole thing in crimp really comes into a question. And we've got a lot of things to argue about in the alpaca industry, and crimp is probably the least important of any of them.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
There's so much more that could be done.
And so is curvature, John. Curvature is not the big deal it used to be. One of the problems with the curvature number from SGS is that the research shows that if you take 2 millimeter snippets, you change the curvature simply by cutting the fiber at both ends. So the curvature number is a problem. It is a problem straight up.
Does it increase or decrease it?
It lowers the number. So you actually get a lower number of degrees. So if you look at high frequency, they're probably around 70 to 80 to 90 degrees. If you look at Suri, they're around 10 or 15 degrees. So if you cut 2 millimeters out of a piece of fiber, the fiber tends to straighten out. Whereas if you look at the fiber testing over a complete staple length, there is no straightening out, and so you get a more accurate descriptor.
So what you're saying is that the orthocortex is showing up here on this slide actually has some level of stress in it that allows it to stay crimpy. Yeah.
Yeah. It has to have that stress in it because that's the elasticity that allows the thing to stretch and contract. The orthocortex is all about elasticity.
Nice. Interesting. Yeah. I know, people have reported alpacas having a curvature of 60. And if that's done with that, we could be in the 70s or so. And
yes.
My personal opinion, I think the sweet spot, I mean, vicuñas are what, 80 to 90, they're under 100, is that we're probably, very close to where we need to be optimal on curvature for developing a nice thread or fiber or yarn. Yes.
Depending on what you want to use the yarn for. If you want memory, then you want the high curvature number. It's just an interesting discussion.
Well, and of course, I'm going to have to stop the recording here because I think we're over.
So as a follow-up to the questions and discussions here at the end of the video, I'd like to close with this slide on breeding strategies. Whenever you're looking at improving or changing a production trait in a breeding, it's imperative to look at how it's going to affect other traits. For an example, fiber diameter and fleece weight are linked as our curvature and staple length. And if you're not looking as to how that may change another trait, then you're going to be putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I think we see that today as we're looking at very nice character animals, but their staple lengths are getting shorter and shorter. So as we get into EPDs, we can show you how that system is intrinsically designed to help avoid those problems. Please feel free to leave your questions or comments in the section below or to email them. Again, thank you for watching.